Okay, next week on Tuesday we're having a guest speaker from this institute called the Population Connection. So he'll be giving the lecture. Pretty interesting speaker, talking about overpopulation, that sort of stuff. So this is kind of where we left off. With HIV, since it evolves rapidly because it's an RNA virus, that means it's it uses RNA instead of DNA. RNA is single-stranded. You remember, RNA is used for transcription, taking DNA into RNA, and then you take that strand and run it through ribosomes and you get proteins. Well, the RNA from the virus is actually copied into DNA, and then the cell that's infected actually pumps out virus particles plus the proteins that are around the viruses, and those proteins are used to connect to certain proteins on the cell. So initially they used a single drug. That's all they had when HIV first showed up. It worked well for about a couple of months, but then there was resistance evolution. HIV, just like it's a virus, but just like bacteria, it evolves resistance as well. Plus, HIV, as I mentioned, infects many different kinds of cells, and in each of those areas, the environment is slightly different, so you get different strains of HIV inside of a person who's infected. So what they finally did was they developed a combination therapy of 3 drugs, and each of those drugs kills the virus in a different way, so that even if there's resistance to one of those drugs, the other 2 will still work. And it's essentially turned HIV into a chronic disease, including most of the actually cases of HIV now are in Africa, but there's still a fair number here. And when these drugs first came out, they were expensive, but finally the drug companies actually made them available, and so the incidence in Africa has come way down. People aren't dying quite as much as they used to, and so these drugs work great, but they don't eliminate or cure HIV. If you have HIV and you take these drugs, there'll be no detectable virus in your bloodstream. Basically, the virus is held in latency inside the cell's DNA. But if you were to stop, then the virus would come back. So they still haven't found a way to actually cure it. And then there are some people who were born with a mutation on their T4 killer cells in the white blood cells. These are part of the immune system. And that is where the HIV manages to infect the cell. So it normally uses this area with its own proteins to glom onto it and then inject its RNA into the cell. There are some people with a mutation where that protein that it gloms onto on the outside of the cell is a mutated form, and it cannot do that. And those people are essentially protected from getting HIV. They had this mutation before, obviously, before HIV even showed up, probably from a previous infection of something like it. And there's probably other mutations that are like that. So some people are born with mutations. If HIV, it's obviously a fairly virulent virulent disease, but because it doesn't kill people immediately, it's still able to be transmitted on a regular basis. So if someone gets infected with HIV, their immune system is probably in pretty good shape for a while. And during that time, let's say they're having sex or they're drug users and sharing needles, they can still pass it on to other people. So it's not like Ebola that kills people right away. But there are probably other groups of people with other mutations that are kind of like this. So they're kind of investigating that in terms of perhaps using stem cell therapy to perhaps try to cure people with HIV. But at this point, it's mainly the drug therapy thing. So anybody wanted to describe what Ebola virus is? Anybody know what it is? You know what Ebola is? Anybody? Okay. There was I guess it was 2 years ago, in Africa, there was an outbreak of Ebola. It's a hemorrhagic fever. It causes people who have it to eventually start bleeding everywhere and dying. And the fatality rate was anywhere from 50% to 90%. Ebola is not a terribly contagious disease. You actually have to be in close contact with someone and get bodily fluids on it. So most people, when Ebola first showed up in the 70s, it was in the Congo and small villages. Usually what would happen is someone would get sick with Ebola, they die. The villagers would wash the body, prepare it for burial, and everybody else would get sick too, and the whole village would be wiped out. Then they started sending in physicians when they heard about this and to treat it, and most of those healthcare workers got it too. So it's not transmitted through the air like influenza, but it is transmitted for people who are in close contact with patients. And usually within, I think it takes anywhere from a week to 3 weeks to show up in terms of symptoms. And then within a few days, people die. So a couple of years ago, it actually showed up in West Africa with higher population densities, and it actually got into cities, and it killed, I don't know, infected something like 30,000 people and killed a bunch of them. And there was all sorts of, well, you can imagine people were terrified. In fact, people over here were terrified, and there were all these politicians who were saying we shouldn't let anybody in from West Africa, even though a lot of people from here who were healthcare workers went to West Africa to help in the outbreak. So they're working on a vaccine now. I think they might have a vaccine, and they've got some drugs that might work. But anyway, it's one of those diseases that is kind of like the plague. The thing is, it looks like possibly the primary host for Ebola are fruit bats, but they don't get sick. So occasionally what happens is some animal or human wanders into a cave or a roost where fruit bats are pooping, and they get infected, and it then spreads to other animals like chimpanzees and things like that, and then it gets into a human population, and then it kind of burns itself out. Okay, so it's kind of, this virus is what it looks like. It's a member of the filoviruses. You don't have to know that. Now, one other kind of infectious agent out there, and instead of it being a pathogen, a microbial pathogen, whether it's a single-celled eukaryote like Plasmodium for malaria, whether it's a virus, a bacteria, an archaea, there are some that are not that. In fact, the infectious agent is actually a normal protein that gets misfolded. Now, proteins are normally folded in a three-dimensional fashion so that they work properly. In this case, these misfolded proteins in neural tissue, like the brain and spinal cord and things like that, is misfolded. And when it touches other proteins adjacent to it, it causes those to misfold. And so you end up with a disease of the brain, so neurological. It might not start actually causing disease right away, but when it does, it's devastating. There's motor neuron problems, cognitive neuron problems, and then within usually a month, let's say, of showing symptoms, the people die. Now, prion diseases were first discovered in New Guinea. So, who in here likes to eat human flesh? Anybody? Good, I'm glad. So you know what I'm talking about. There's a tribe in New Guinea. They don't do it anymore. They're called the North Four. And they had a neurological disease. And they found out it was because they practiced cannibalism. Now, they didn't practice the kind of cannibalism where someone goes out, kills someone, and eats them to gain their power. They did it with their own people. They kind of ancestor worship. So when someone died, they would cut up that person, and everybody would eat that person. The men were the warriors, and all they ate was the flesh. But the women and children actually ate neurological tissue like the brains and the spinal cord. And when they ate it, usually a few months later, they'd start showing neurological symptoms. And it was actually a disease that was being passed down or being passed to people from eating this tissue. So they finally, some Australians went in and finally actually explained to the people that this is what was happening, and they got them to stop cannibalizing their fellows. So, and then they discovered, in fact, that it was actually a protein and not an infectious agent like a microbe. Now, anybody hear of mad cow disease? Okay. In Great Britain, there were these cows. Well, there's a kind of disease called scrapie that sheep and cows and other ungulates get. That's the same sort of a disease. And so it's called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE. And it started showing up in people, and they realized it was coming from Great Britain. It was about 10 years ago or something like that. So they started checking cows for it, and cattle, and also over here as well. But at the time, people would eat, let's say, brains and things like that. You can still go to countries where they eat brains. Lots of places in Europe, Mexico. They're actually pretty good, by the way. I remember eating brains and eggs. It was pretty delicious, actually. Didn't make me smarter. So there are these prion diseases. There's another one called fatal familial insomnia, where someone actually inherits it, and they can't sleep. So once they start showing symptoms, they're basically they try to put them to sleep with all kinds of drugs. It doesn't work. You can imagine not being able to sleep ever. And then within short order, they die. Okay. So you stop eating meat because of prions? No. Meats. Meat's good. Ribeye is good. Chicken is good. Meat is good. Okay? Now, some of you probably don't like meat, or have decided that you don't want to really have animals killed so you can eat meat. Because I'm really not sensitive to animals. Of course, I eat them with abandon, and it doesn't seem to bother me. But it might bother you. But anyway, you don't have to worry about the meat supply. Now, we're going to change focus here. We've been talking about pathogens, organisms that cause disease in humans. Why is it that we're not infected with all these pathogens all the time? Anybody? Are we just like, oh, they're not going to bother us or something like that? What do you think stops diseases or disease-causing organisms from causing disease in us?
Immune system.
Okay, exactly. We have a pretty elaborate immune system. All living things have some form of immune system, like even bacteria. They have something called the CRISPR-Cas9 system that's now used for gene editing, but it protects them against infection by viruses. So bacteria can be affected by viruses. The viruses inject their RNA or DNA into the bacteria produces a virus just like normal. If the bacteria didn't have a way of protecting itself, then viruses would wipe them out. But that's not the case. They do have immune systems. In fact, they actually have what's called an adaptive immune system. Once bacteria get infected, remember they reproduce by making copies of themselves, clones. what happens is the bacteria copy some of the virus. The next time they're infected with a virus, they have this enzyme that chops the virus up. Okay. Plants have immune systems. They're not necessarily adaptive immune systems, but they work fairly well. All kinds of animals, some of them have more advanced immune systems than others. Vertebrates have a very advanced immune system. And the immune system, well, people didn't really know much about it until, I guess, until AIDS came along. As you know, AIDS, the HIV virus attacks the immune cells. When people started trying to understand what was going on, they started to learn a lot more about the immune system and what it does. We have two parts to our immune system. All vertebrates do. There's called an innate immune system. Okay? It doesn't require, an innate system doesn't require memory of previous infections. And by mean memory, antigens that our immune cells recognize from previous infections. Our innate immune system includes physical barriers like our skin and the bacteria on our skin that actually protects us from other bacteria. Anytime there's inflammation, our innate immune system goes in and all these macrophages hone in on anything that's foreign. And that'll actually then institute what's called an adaptive immune system, where the immune system starts to recognize, oh, this is something that's causing disease in humans. If we didn't have this immune system, we wouldn't be here. If you think about it, HIV destroys our immune system, and people with a destroyed immune system, they get all sorts of diseases from organisms that normally we have in our body that don't cause disease. Our immune system keeps them at bay. So, like in our gut, we have trillions of bacteria and fungi and viruses, all sorts of different things. Some of them actually do things that are good for us, but if we didn't have an immune system, they would probably attack our bodies. Okay, so there's this innate immune system. And then there's an adaptive immune system in which an infection caused by a specific, let's say, bacteria, that bacteria on its outside, on the outside bacterial wall, will have proteins. The body's immune system will then recognize those proteins. And they will start, those cells that recognize those will start multiplying and multiplying. And they will not only send out these small proteins called antibodies, but they will also hone in on those bacteria. And that's how our immune system clears the infection. And after that, if you're infected again with that same sort of pathogen, your immune system is already primed, and it doesn't have to take a few days to ramp up, or a week, or whatever. It's right away, and so even if you've been infected again, it'll knock that pathogen down before there's any sort of disease, unless you have a compromised immune system. So, we have an adaptive immune system and an innate one. So the innate one includes skin, cilia, like in our lungs, we have all these cells with, kind of like little hairs So like when we, let's say, have a cough, we cough stuff out. The cilia trap things, and then they're enveloped in mucus, and then we spew it out, right? A lot of our bodily fluids, like tears and saliva, have basically like antibiotics. Also, if we get infected, our body oftentimes, now you might think that, if you get infected with a bacteria, perhaps you get a fever. Why do you get a fever? So let's consider a couple of different hypotheses. The one is that, in fact, the pathogen causes a fever. Okay? It causes inflammation and a fever. The thing is, scientists started recognizing something that didn't kind of fit with that, and that is that a high temperature often kills the pathogen. Okay, so if a pathogen causes a fever, it's also killing itself. That doesn't make much sense. So they started thinking, well, what's another explanation? And instead of thinking that a fever is just a symptom caused by the causative agent, in this case the microbe, it's actually our own immune system, our innate immune system, that actually raises our body's temperature. So that higher body temperature may make us feel awful, but it might also kill the pathogen. So inflammation and fever, for the most part, is a body's response to infection by a pathogen. Now, sometimes you can have such a high fever that it actually can kill you because you're under attack, like Ebola. People commonly ran temperatures of 104 and 105, and they were terribly, terribly ill. And a temperature like that is, over a period of time, is going to kill someone. But, of course, the disease itself killed them before that would actually happen. Okay. Let's see. Anybody in here get hay fever? Anybody have a food allergy or anything like that? You're all healthy as clams. Okay, that's good. I'm happy. Okay, allergies are our immune system attacking stuff that normally would not cause us harm, like pollen. Why does it do this? There's some genetics involved. It might just be that our immune system hasn't been trained properly in terms of what we're infected with when we're infants and whatnot. We'll get into that a little bit. But our cells with hay fever, oftentimes you're sneezing and all that. What your cells are doing is releasing something called histamine, and that's why you take antihistamines to stop that from happening. But that histamine is there to counteract invasion by microbes or by allergens, things that our body thinks are infectious agents but aren't. And in terms of inflammation and fever, histamine is released, other things are released, and white blood cells go to an area, and this inflammation inhibits the growth of microbes. Some things, in fact, inflammation has actually been recognized to cause chronic disease in people. So oftentimes, let's say with people who have something like an autoimmune disease like rheumatoid arthritis, they're actually treated with an immunosuppressant drug like prednisone. Okay, and then adaptive immunity is, in this case, it's specific immunity to an infection so that when you're reinfected, let's say later exposed to that pathogen, you will not get sick because your immune system, your adaptive immune system, remembers that infection by remembering certain proteins. So, one of the things that our adaptive immune system does is it produces these proteins called antibodies that, when they come into contact with molecules that that the body has previously been exposed to, they lock on to these chemicals. These are called antigens that the microbe has. So, there are two kinds of lymphocytes that are part of this adaptive immune system. They're B cells and T cells. They produce these antibodies to recognize self from non-self. All of these things like that, those are all different kinds of proteins, let's say in a virus or a bacteria. And when that bacteria infects someone, our immune system starts recognizing those proteins. And then they start producing these antibodies that glom onto these proteins all around the cell. And then all the immune cells, like lymphocytes, go in and destroy it. Okay, so B and T lymphocytes are produced in the bone marrow from what kind of cells are in the bone marrow? Are they fully developed cells or not? No. What are they?
Lymphocytes.
Starts with an S. Stem cells. Okay? These are adult stem cells. And they're multipotent, right? That means they're stem cells that can only turn into certain types of tissue or cells. In this case, they can turn into lymphocytes and B cells. But at this point, they're not that. So these are the cells that carry the memory of previous infections. That's why a vaccine actually works. When someone gets injected with, let's say, a vaccine, what the vaccine is doing is prepping your immune system to recognize certain infectious agents. Now, some of these infectious agents evolve, like flu virus. They evolve rapidly, and you have all these different strains. When they evolve, the immune system may not recognize them as virus anymore, and it's like being infected with a whole new pathogen. And that's why you actually need a vaccine every year, because there are different strains of flu that are circulating and evolving and changing. Okay, but normally our immune system, once it's been infected with something, sometimes you get what's called long-term immunity, and that's why when you're kids, you get all these vaccines. You get vaccines for measles, mumps, and rubella, MMR, You get vaccines for all sorts of things. You can get vaccines. Let's say you're going into South America, you'll get a yellow fever vaccine now because there's an outbreak of yellow fever. They're developing vaccines for dengue fever, all kinds of vaccines. Okay. So in terms of our immune system, the first time we're actually exposed to a foreign antigen, let me write that down. Our adaptive immune system, so our innate immune system will attack it, but not specifically. But our adaptive immune system hasn't encountered it before, hasn't encountered those proteins on the outside of those cells that are infecting us, and so our adaptive immune system is slow. It may take a week after infection before our immune system starts killing these cells. If it's a really virulent pathogen, that might be too long and the person might die before the immune system can actually kill all those particles. Ebola is like that. So they're working on, I think actually they do have an Ebola vaccine now, just starting to come online. So what will happen is people will get a vaccine for Ebola. They'll be immune then to Ebola the next time it comes around. Okay, so that's how vaccines work. So once our immune system has been kind of exposed to a pathogen, whether just from a normal infection that we've had previously or from a vaccine, so that we kind of boost the immune system, it'll respond immediately. Any of those particles, whether they're bacteria or viruses or whatever, our immune cells will recognize them and there'll be a full immune response within a few hours, and that normally protects us. Now, when we get a vaccine, oftentimes, we often actually feel kind of sick because we're initiating an infection that we're tricking our body into thinking it's being attacked by a bacteria. The vaccine is really not a bacteria. It's probably it's the kinds of proteins or something like that that the body will recognize as non-self and mount an immune response. So if you've ever, let's say, gone overseas and had a vaccine, I don't know, for typhoid fever or something, oftentimes you'll get sick, you'll have symptoms, a high fever and all that for a day. But after that, if you come in contact with the pathogen, you won't have any problems. So that's how our immune system, our adaptive immune system, actually protects us, because we have all these things that we've been exposed to in our lifetime. So there's a lot of things that we're exposed to all the time that you were exposed to previously, and either you survive those and your immune system will have remembered those. Okay. They make vaccines out of all sorts of different things. In the past, like with polio, they would use a weakened virus that doesn't cause symptoms. So you inject that into someone, the immune response starts, and then the next time you're exposed to that virus, your immune system is ready. some people are freaked out about. Anybody in here afraid of vaccines? So you don't mind that someone injects something into your body. What about heroin? Are you afraid that if someone injects you with heroin? No? Okay. Next class will bring that in so you can reply. Okay, so there's a lot of craziness going on about vaccines, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But first of all, what's in a vaccine? Now, sometimes they also use, let's say, dead organisms, like dead viruses, to start an immune response. They find out what works. What was anybody know what the first vaccine was?
Is it for measles?
Huh?
Is it for measles? It was like during the Civil War.
No. Before that? Smallpox. Okay, there was a fellow by the name of Edward Jenner. He got credit for it. But it was kind of known beforehand. So smallpox, it turns out, has been eradicated from the planet. The only smallpox that's left over now, anywhere, are in labs. Smallpox had about a 30% mortality rate, pretty high. It had a huge effect on populations that had never been exposed to it before, like Native Americans. So when Europeans came over, and some of them might have had smallpox, Native Americans were infected, and it would just wipe out villages completely. Okay, so it's caused by a virus. Now, Jenner recognized that these women who were milkmaids would often get this cowpox that was similar, and those women, anytime an outbreak of smallpox would come along, would appear to be immune to the smallpox. So he started collecting cowpox and then using it to vaccinate the neighborhood. And when that happened, those people were actually immune then to smallpox. It took a while for this to catch on. He lived in the 18th century, 1700s. Now, other people had kind of recognized this earlier, but had not been systematic about it. In fact, there was actually vaccination by taking real live smallpox, a small amount, and vaccinating people with it. And you think, well, why would you do that? You're giving them smallpox. Well, they would only about 1% of the people who got vaccinated that way would actually get full-blown smallpox. The rest of them would survive it. But 1% is still, or up to 1 to 4% is still substantial. So 1 out of every 100 persons. So they did this, but then Jenner actually discovered the cowpox. Now, cowpox doesn't cause any real serious disease. It's very related to smallpox. So he started vaccinating people by taking the pustules and then taking that stuff and using like a pin or a nail or something like that. And you might have even recognized that your parents might have had a big kind of mark on their arm from during that time when they were vaccinated from smallpox. No one gets vaccinated from smallpox anymore. There's no reason to. In this case, the vaccine has actually eradicated a deadly disease. We're close to another deadly disease that's being eradicated called polio, which attacks the nervous system. It was a scourge of everybody, and even if it didn't kill people, it killed a lot of people, but it would also leave them paralyzed. And sometimes they couldn't breathe, sometimes they couldn't, oftentimes couldn't walk. Well, the vaccine for polio, there's only a few cases of polio left in the world. It's still somewhat endemic in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And then also, I think maybe in Nigeria, but it's on the way out. It's in India and Pakistan, it's endemic because anytime you send up health care workers in there to help the people, the Taliban kill them because, you know, they're Western and they're kind of trying to turn people not Muslim anymore or something. That's what they think. Okay. Now, nowadays, a lot of vaccines are actually made through biological engineering by making those antigens themselves and injecting those in to a person. Those can't, of course, cause any infection, but they will stimulate the immune system. So some of these things, the immune system lasts for life, others don't, where you need constant revaccination. Okay, so here's that antigen, the foreign protein again, just so you recognize that. So, why do we need to get a new shot for flu every year? What do you think?
The strand changes each year.
What?
The flu virus changes each year.
Okay, that's called evolution. Exactly. The flu virus is a retrovirus. That means the virus has an RNA instead of a DNA. It mutates rapidly. And so, just like that mutation with bacteria, you get these strains and our body doesn't recognize those as causing disease. So what happens is every year around the world, health organizations get together and start recognizing what strains of flu and new strains are out there, and then they tailor a vaccine for those strains. Some years are better than others. A few years ago, there was a vaccine that hardly worked at all. They guessed wrong. But in general, they do pretty well. Most people don't die of flu, but especially older people, when they get lung infections, it might turn into pneumonia, and it might kill them. So a lot of older people get flu vaccine, but anybody can get a flu vaccine, and it'll protect you. Okay, so, oh, I know what I wanted to do. Hold on. Okay. So there's this virus. It has this protein coat. When the virus is replicated inside a cell or a bacteria, there's always a chance for mutations. I mean, mutations are the basis for all variability. So, when you actually get, during viral replication, you get some mutants. Now, as I mentioned, most mutations are bad because the mutations It's actually a gene that codes for a specific protein. If you have a mutation, that protein is probably not doing its job anymore. But occasionally, that protein may still work and may be beneficial. In this case, because they're changing these proteins, the function, in this case, some of the functions are maintained, but because there's been a change on these viral proteins, our immune system doesn't recognize it as flu virus from a previous infection. Now, when that happens, we say that there's antigenic drift. Similar, we learned about drift in populations during the evolutionary portion of the class, where small populations are particularly prone. Well, it's the same sort of thing. You get these small mutations that might not, the function might still be the same, all that, but unfortunately our immune system doesn't recognize it, and so doesn't start an immune response to protect. Okay, so that's why we get vaccines for flu every year, because the virus is mutating so rapidly. Okay, antigenic drift. So the virus, just by replicating, you get small mutations, and those small mutations are no longer recognized. And then antigenic shift is different, where two different strains infect the same cell, their antigens get all mixed up, and you've got a virus that has different antigens on their surface, and they're not recognized either. Another strain of the virus that infects the same cell. Okay. Okay, these are two different viruses. They've got two different proteins, H1, N1, and H2, N2. When they are infecting a cell, remember those viral RNA or DNA are incorporated into the cell. There's reassorted, and then when new particles are, viral particles are made by the cell, a lot of times those genomes get combined. So now the virus has an N1 antigen and an N2 antigen. Okay, so N1, N2, and it might also have like an H1 antigen. And so you might end up with a virus that's H1N1, H2N2, or H1H2N1, or H1H2N2, or finally another combination is N1 and N2 together. Okay, well, let's say the virus that the immune system responded to was originally H1. So when that viral protein is exposed, there's an immune response. But there's also a viral protein N2 that's not. Okay, and so that cell is actually protected, or that cell can be infected by the one that it doesn't recognize. So when these strains are created from two different strains or more, you can end up with a virus that is much more variable, And the new strain now has H, like the one on the bottom here. It might be H2N1, and our immune response doesn't recognize that right away. Now, that is called antigenic shift, different than antigenic drift. Okay. So here's a flu virus. The N protein is this. It's actually an enzyme. And the H protein is hemagglutinin. And the H protein helps the virus get into the cells, and the N protein helps the virus get out of cells. Okay? Now, they use these proteins because they glom onto a cell's proteins. All cells have proteins on the outside. They've evolved to do that. In other words, there's been mutations so that those individual particles can actually glom on and inject their viral RNA. And if the body doesn't recognize those, then you get a new strain. Now, they actually refer to different viral strains with either an H or an N and numbers. So the swine flu that caused this major epidemic in 1919, it looks like it originally started with pigs that were probably infected by birds. And then it jumped into humans. And so it was an H1N1 viral influenza. Avian flu, the kind that oftentimes circulates among birds, which are the primary host, usually are H5N1 avian flus. Avian flus are not really generally very infective of people. Our immune system doesn't have the proteins on the outside for those cells to be infected by H5. Now, for the N, there's actually 9 different N variants, H5N1, N2, N3, N4, and so on. For the H protein, there's at least 17 alleles on the virus, same way. So you can see how each of those strains, the immune system is probably not going to recognize as related to the other ones. Okay, so just to go over, antigenic drift is for mutation. A virus, as it's being copied inside a cell, ends up with mutations. Those mutations are different enough so that the immune system doesn't recognize it. Antigenic shift involves 2 different strains that those proteins are now combined, and the body doesn't recognize those either. These is actually called recombinant virus. It's kind of like recombinant DNA that we talked about with like corn, what was it called? GMOs. Okay. So here's the 1918 influenza virus. It was the end of World War I. It killed like 50 million people worldwide. It actually was responsible for a lot of the deaths of soldiers. It was highly infective. and also high mortality, and it killed more soldiers than people died on the battlefield. Okay. Now, herd immunity. So, a lot of times you use a vaccine and it protects everyone in the population, even individuals that haven't been vaccinated. Because let's say 90% of the population is vaccinated and immune, and there's not very many susceptible individuals. Now, there are some people that can't be vaccinated. People with immune problems, either from something like HIV, or they're transplant patients and they're taking drugs that suppress the immune system so that the immune system doesn't attack the transplants. So there's all kinds of people like that. Some people are even born without a functioning immune system. You might have heard about the bubble boy, who had to grow up inside a bubble because anything that he was exposed to caused infection. Okay. Now, in terms of the measles, this herd immunity generally protected everybody. But because of this erroneous information about vaccines causing autism, there were a lot of people. It's kind of weird. Most of them are in California and other states where there's a lot of education. You'd think that it wouldn't be happening, but that's actually the case. And so you get whole communities where all the parents think, oh, there's this cause and effect, and those individuals won't get their kids vaccinated. Okay. Now, it turns out that that paper that I want you guys to take a look at, measles, the virus measles attacks the immune system cells. They attack the B cells that I've talked about. Those are the cells that different ones have different antigens from previous infections. Okay, so if you get infected with measles, that's what it gloms onto. If you get vaccinated, it initiates the immune response. Unfortunately, those cells recognize all the previous infections an individual has had. And it wipes out their immune system temporarily. They used to think maybe a couple of weeks after you got infected with measles, but then your immune system would start to come back. It turns out it's a lot longer than that. And so some scientists actually did an experiment. Well, they actually did a survey. They couldn't do an experiment. They did an experiment with something like that with mice. But they noticed that people who had measles vaccine or who didn't have measles vaccine and got measles were more likely to die of some other microbial infection, ones that they had probably been exposed to at an earlier time. And so even though they didn't die of measles, they actually died because the measles had kind of conked out their immune system, and they were suddenly susceptible to all these sorts of things. So it turns out that individuals who don't get the measles vaccine, if they get infected with measles, they're at increased risk of dying from all these other microbial things that they were already immune to previously, but they're not anymore. Okay. So I just want you guys to understand, if you ever have those little whippersnappers that get sick all the time, make sure they get vaccinated. And that's it. Oh, one other thing.